somebody told me a rumor a while ago said that you did student ministry for about 10 years.
I did 10 years of youth ministry before I came head of staff.
Has that helped you in your senior pastorship?
Yeah, because when I showed up here, and in the first couple of weeks, my lawn was filled with forks. I knew how to take that in stride. I understood where that came from.
That's great. Well, I read, and this is one thing you really ought to read because this is powerful. I read what you wrote to your daughter when you baptized her. And how long ago was that?
That was just a couple months ago. Not that
a couple
long
months ago.
Yeah.
It was very moving. One of our staff members was reading it last night, and I was looking through that, and it's moving to baptize your own child, isn't it?
Yeah. When I first had a daughter several years ago, my congregation said, you cry a lot more when you preach than you used to.
That happens with age, too.
I think I know where that comes from,
Yeah, that's for sure.
It gets in there somewhere.
Because as a parent, you look at life through a different filter, don't you?
Yeah, you do. And both in a very exciting way and kind of an anxious way about the world.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, we're talking about shaping a kid's worldview here, and I want to put up something that you had on your blog, and I want you to talk about it for just a second. Because this was a quote that we read a little earlier this week. God gave reason to us. I love this. God gave reason to us like a telescope and urges us to peek. He's not afraid of intelligent questions about him. He would much rather us investigate with the passion of a treasure hunter than with the passivity of a reporter. That is just great. So when you wrote that and when you think about this, how does the church do that in your mind? What would you give this audience of leaders as far as some kind of advice related to raising the next generation and shaping their worldview?
Yeah. Well, you and the generation before us has already done a tremendous job of advancing youth ministry and children's ministry into a world that's totally different than what I grew up with. Because I grew up in a church that made me not want to go to church. I actually remember this one point where I was sitting in a pew and I took my shoes off because I was thinking, this is God's house. And in my house, I take my shoes off. And I'm in God's house. I'm a kid. And so I took my shoes off and I was just thinking, I'm in God's house. And the lady in front of me turned around to me and went, church is not a place where we make ourselves comfortable. Right? And so it's amazing that I have the job that I do, given the experience that I had growing up. But it was the youth ministries that first embraced me and brought me in and helped me to see, one, that God was not distant, and two, that church was not stale. And so you have already pioneered what we got to inherit, and now the next generation carries that on.
Well, that's huge. That's huge because what you just described again to me was somebody who came along and made church more than a place or a building, but a relationship.
Right.
Okay, you want to expound on that?
Yeah,
I think you want to say something. I don't want to get in the way.
No, I was in a student ministry that adopted me in when I was in high school, and suddenly saw Jesus through the lens of my youth pastor, and really that he was the one that engaged me and pointed me in the direction of a God I had never seen before, a God I had heard about but had not experienced, and it was that relationship with my youth pastor. I was in a youth group of 10 kids at a little church that had no budget. I'm not sure if the church is even still open today. It was struggling to stay afloat, but that guy in that church is what put me on the trajectory there.
He probably had no idea at the time that his investment in your life,
right,
like a lot of these leaders, I mean, you could have been the kid they thought, he'll never change. You could have been. I'm not saying you were that kind of kid. You could have been. Okay. Well, here's a question I asked all these other senior pastors when I got to their church, because I think every senior pastor kind of has this in their heart. And I want to ask you this. What's something that you wish more leaders understood about the mission of the church? In other words, you got all these leaders out here. They're working in student ministries. Some are senior pastors, some are executive pastors with children. And what is the one thing you would say, please, as you think about going forward, don't miss this?
Yeah. I think there's a huge temptation in ministry. There's a huge battle that we fight against our own egos. And I think there's a temptation in ministry to say, I want to make a difference. I want to show that I've had an effect. I want them to remember my name. And at the end of the day, what I wish church leadership knew and remembered is that we do this for him. And at the end of the day, our hope is that we would disappear in the shadow of the cross.
Oh, that's great.
And honestly, if every pastor in America would wake up in the morning and say that in the mirror, we'd have a better church.
Wow, that's powerful. I think there's something about the platform of ministry that creates a false sense of our ego and importance. And And how would you lean into leaders? Because here's the truth. The truth is, every church I've ever been in and ever worked in, someone else is doing my job. And that I think it was Jeff Foxworthy who said, somebody asked...
Theologian Jeff Foxworthy.
Theologian Jeff Foxworthy. We were hanging out, because I'm best friends with him. No, it's just good. But he is a friend of our staff and a friend of our team. And he said the other day, has anyone ever asked you this question, if you could name your great-grandfather? He said, somebody asked that question the other day. He said, I know I did the name of my great-grandfather, who my great-grandfather was. I don't know him. That's how quick.
Right. Doesn't take long.
It fades.
Yeah.
And it goes. And I think you're right, that we've got to connect them to something much bigger than our reputation or our influence.
Right.
How do they do that? What are some practical ways you would say, get out of the way?
Yeah. Well, here's what I'd recommend for people working, and lots of children and student ministers here today, right? And I did this for 10 years. If you can get a hold of students in their younger years, in their ninth grade years, and begin to prepare them for the future, I'd tell them to be more intentional about who they paired themselves up with in their early years of high school, or in children's ministry in their early years, because we end up paired up with the people who end up just sitting around us. I was in, I think, 6th grade before I realized that all my best friends' last names started with the letter M, because we were all assigned to the same homeroom in alphabetical order. And so for years we were buddies, because that's where we were put. And you don't necessarily, I think we do that as adults too. Yeah. We end up paired up with people who are around us. If you can start to think intentionally about who you pair yourself up with, that will determine a lot of your future. And you can either pair yourself up with somebody who'll be like a rocket, or somebody who'll be like an anchor and sink you. And Jesus is going to be like that. So if we teach our students, you're pairing yourself up with someone who's going to decide where you go. Pairing yourself up with Jesus is what's going to decide your future. Not who you are, or what you prove, or what you achieve, but who you're tied to.
That's good. That's really good. Well, there's another quote that I found on your blog, and I want to talk about this. We can actually affirm those elements of our tradition which we value while admitting that it's time for a game changer. In other words, you're talking about denominationalism.
Yeah.
And you almost were explaining a paradox that exists, that we have to hold on to what's important, insights, the great commandment, the principles that we know are anchored, that we need to be anchored to, while at the same time changing some things. Expound on that.
Yeah. Well, here at Glenkirk, we did something radical. We threw away the choir robes. And that in itself is not a game changer, but it's a symbol of the game that's being changed, right? And it's the church saying, we're not going to be vital in the future the way we were vital in the past. And the fact that we were vital in the past is great and crucial, but it was not the trappings of the vitality that we need to hold on to. And so in the midst of doing that, we had some significant personnel changes. Always before in the history of Glenkirk, the choir director had been the head of worship, and he had retired, and we replaced him with a 33-year-old guitarist. And that for Glenkirk was a huge historic move. We changed our budgeting and staff all around. We hired the best student pastor on the continent, and we already had the best children's pastor on the continent. And I think we just about doubled the children's budget one of those years, and we've beefed up those budgets. We've just signed on with an architecture firm to say we need a children's building that ministers in 2011, because the one that we had did a great job in 1977. But the day has come where, and it's not that what we did in the past was bad, it's just it doesn't work the same way anymore. And so there are, and there are those who love that, and those who get it, and those who, think you're a nice person.
That's great. That's great. That's so important. We had Howard Hendricks come to North Point for a conference years and years ago, and he talked about consulting with the church, that when he got through the consulting, they asked us, so what do you think? He said, I think you should put ropes up outside the doors and charge 50 cents admission to show people what church used to look like 50 years ago.
Wow, how'd that go over?
I mean, it was, Howard Hendricks is like 60 to 70 years of age, so he could say it and get away with it.
That, yeah.
But now when you're pastoring a church and you're leaning in trying to get them to change, I mean, he could walk away the next day.
Right.
He did his consulting gig, and it's done, and people don't have to like him. And so when you're transitioning a people, what would be one of the key things you would say, here's some things to think about?
Well, you have to love them, and they have to know that you love them. But I've stood up here week after week, where we no longer have a pulpit, and said, I love you, but Glenkirk exists to lead uncommitted people to become fully devoted followers of Jesus. We do not exist to offer the familiar to the already Christian so they can be comfortable. And if you're looking for a church like that, I can refer you to one, but this is not it.
Oh.
And it's not that I don't like you, but we're here to lead uncommitted people to Jesus, and we're going to do that every single week. And I've said to them before, and it's very sensitive how and when you say this, but I've said, the vision of the church is not for sale. And I know some of you would say, I'll donate if you'll do X, Y, and Z, but Jesus would not say that, and I'm not going to take your money in exchange for the vision of the church.
That is great. That is great. Give him a hand. I love that. That's great. At some point, I wish I had connected these dots earlier, but I want to introduce you to Kerry Newhoff, who's a Presbyterian pastor in Toronto. Used to be a Presbyterian pastor, but he transitioned to Presbyterian church at one stage of his ministry, and he decided they were going to take the organ out. Actually, he was starting a new church, and he said, we're not going to put an organ in it, and he had the elders vote never to put an organ in the church. And I'm not saying that organs are bad. It was just, from Kerry's point of perspective, Kerry said he was driving around Toronto, Canada, and he couldn't find any radio stations that had organ music.
Right.
So he thought, so why are we going to push something that doesn't connect with people? But the funny thing was, all the elders, they got these shirts printed up that said, be an organ donor. And just to encourage people in a fun way. Nice. But I think it's so important that we keep the mission of the church separate in what we're called to do. And here's another question. This is another question that I want to ask related to your work as a student pastor. Now you're a senior pastor. Now you're leading a team of people that are working with the next generation. And I know this is in you because you got young children. I think you said you've got a 4-year-old?
7-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son.
How's that gone for you so far?
Excellent. She's already smarter than both my wife and I. And he, I told you on the first day of preschool this year, asked his teacher for her phone number.
Yeah, see it. Yeah. There's something about being a parent and leading a church that forces authenticity. I mean, you can't. I mean, it just forces it.
Right, because the kids are going to go tell your congregation.
Absolutely.
What you do anyway.
Yeah, I know. So let's just, with that experience in your background, knowing that your kids are moving toward high school at warp speed, if we gave you a group of 9th grade boys, so Jim, here's 6, 7, 9th grade boys. You got them for 4 years.
Yeah.
You could do anything you wanted to do.
Yeah.
What would you do?
Well, and I've done that. And I, in 10 years of youth ministry, I did the Mexico mission trips where we built houses, and those changed people's lives. And of course, the Bible studies and the Halo overnighters, which I am good at. Just so you know, I excelled in the. I was okay at the Bible study, but the Halo overnighter, that was where I really shone, I think. But like I said, if you can get them young and say, pay attention to who your friends are, choose them wisely as opposed to just falling into relationships, those will define you more than you think. And we go at it as Americans with a sense of autonomy. I will define myself, I will make my choices, I will choose who I am. And then you take somebody who's just out of college and say, now how different are you from the circle of friends you just went through school with? And they're usually not. Mm-hmm. And that's because we're not quite so autonomous and independent as we think we are. We're shaped by our friends. So again, that image of the fact that those with whom you pair yourself are either going to be a rocket or an anchor was a key thing for student ministry for me. And Jesus himself, you're going to pair yourself to him, and he's either going to be your rocket into the future, or you can go it on your own.
And so the relationship is the core and the key. That's kind of, I think, the way he discipled. Okay, good. One more question. As you think through your ministry, as you think through your life, as you think through even the last few years here, what would be 1 or 2 things that you would say were game changers for you that made you process this and do this in a different way than you expected you would?
Yeah. Well, like I said, the choir robes was the symbol. We changed the staff, we changed the facilities, we've changed the budgets, we've moved the worship service times, changed the style of the worship service. There are very few stones we've left unturned so far. And I hit my 4-year anniversary next month. So in the first 4 years, they've been an extremely gracious church in letting me come in and tinker. And I told them when they hired me, and this was a few years ago, I said, I'm in my mid-30s. You look like the kind of church that would want to hire a 55-year-old who's been doing this a while and who's a veteran of ministry. Are you sure you know what you're doing? And they said the guy who was here, 40 years ago and stayed to retirement was exactly like you are when we hired him, and we know how that went. And so we want to relive that experience of having somebody pastor us through the course of his life. So they've, in 4 years, let me change a lot of games around here, and it's because they're a gracious and loving congregation.
Wow, that's great.